The night Nyra Vale bled out in a shallow creek bed on the wrong side of the Iron Reach border, wearing a dead man's colors over a wound her own alpha had twisted. The beast inside her opened one eye for the first time in 23 years and decided it was not ready to die. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know any of it. She only knew the cold water licking her ribs, the copper taste flooding the back of her tongue, the gray sky narrowing to a pinhole above the pines, and the far-off sound of hooves that might be mercy or might be the last thing she ever heard. What she didn't know was that the rider coming down the ridge was the very monster her clan had warned her about since she was small enough to sit on her grandmother's knee, and that he would be the first person in her life to look at her throat and see a person rather than a use. The night Nyra Vale bled out in a creek, she was already being hunted by prophecy. And prophecy, it turned out, rode a black horse and answered to the name Cain. Hours earlier, she had been crouched in brush at the edge of a skirmish that had no business being a skirmish at all. The Iron Reach lines should have buckled. Her alpha, Mac Drin, had promised they would buckle. He had stood on a stump 2 nights before with firelight warming the underside of his jaw, and told the Border Clan that tomorrow they would bleed the Human King's army along the ravine, that the safe trails their grandmothers had walked for generations would swallow the Iron Reach column whole. Instead, the column had come down a trail no outsider should have known, flanked the clan runners, and opened them up like wheat. Nyra, small enough to be forgotten and quiet enough to be underestimated, had slipped sideways into the trees to find a better angle for her scout's horn, and there, under a tarp weighted with river stones, she had found the cache. Oiled leather satchels, maps with her grandmother's trails inked in a hand she did not know, a tally of coin in Iron Reach mint, a signet ring pressed into wax she recognized the way a child recognizes her father's voice in the dark. Mac's ring, Mac's writing, Mac's trails, sold. She had not even lifted her head before his shadow fell across her. He had smiled, the way he had smiled at her when she was 7, and he had taught her to set a snare. He had said her name gently. Little Nyra, little scout. And then his knife had come up between them like an old friend, and she had felt the point of it before she had felt the betrayal, because her body was still slower than her heart. She had heard the Iron Reach horn in the distance. She had heard Mac grunt and throw himself sideways as if taking a blow meant for her, which was the part that would later sicken her most, because he had practiced that motion. He had rehearsed the story. The blade had gone in under her ribs and twisted the wrong way out, and he had stripped her cloak and thrown an Iron Reach tabard across her shoulders and rolled her down the bank into the creek with the careful sorrow of a man who had already written the eulogy. Traitor girl, caught in enemy colors. A tragedy, the clan would say, and no one would ever ask what she had been doing in the brush. She lay in the water and counted the things she would not get to do. She would not get to tell December, her best friend since they were both too small to braid their own hair, that the man they had trusted was a thief of lives. She would not get to see her little cousin Lavina's first shift, which everyone in the clan was anxiously waiting for, because Lavina was 11 and still had not turned, and the whispers had started. She would not get to be angry long enough to matter. The beast inside her, which had never once surfaced, which had made her the shame of her mother's house and the pity of every elder, uncurled somewhere behind her sternum and made a sound that was not a sound. It was a hum, a thread, a warmth she had never felt and did not have a name for. It was saying, not yet. It was saying, listen. And then the hooves came down the bank, and a man swung out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and she heard a voice say, low and rough and controlled, She's alive. And she thought, with the last clear thought she had, that the monster her grandmother had described did not sound like a monster at all. Cain of the Iron Reach was 31 years old and had been king for 9 of them, and in those 9 years he had learned 3 useful things. He had learned that a crown sat lighter on a man who slept less. He had learned that a council chamber had more knives in it than a battlefield. And he had learned, recently and unhappily, that somebody on the other side of the border was feeding him intelligence he had never requested, delivered in a handwriting he did not recognize, dropped at relay points his own spy master swore were secure. He did not trust gifts. He trusted them even less when they were accurate. He had ridden the ridge that morning not to win a skirmish, because the skirmish had already been won by the information in his saddlebag, but to find the man who was feeding him the information. Because a gift that useful was a leash, and Cain did not wear leashes. He had expected to find a traitor. He had not expected to find a girl. She was the wrong size for a soldier. That was what he noticed first, crouching beside the creek with his gloved hand hovering above her neck, reading the pulse through the air, because he did not yet want to touch her. She was slight through the shoulders, mud-streaked, dark hair plastered to a cheek that had gone the color of river stone. She was wearing an Iron Reach tabard that did not fit her and had been put on her after she was already bleeding. He could see the stain pattern was wrong. The cloth had soaked from the outside in. Somebody had dressed her for the story. He did not like stories he had not written. He crouched lower and finally laid 2 fingers against the hollow of her throat. Her pulse was there, thready, stubborn. The pulse of something that had been told to quit and had not quit. Her eyes opened. They were the color of a winter field at dusk, and they focused on him with a clarity that had no business being in a body that empty of blood. And the hair on the back of his neck lifted, because something in his chest, something he could not name and would not admit, went quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 9 years. He had felt fear before. He had felt rage. He had felt the cold arithmetic of command. He had never felt recognized. He rocked back onto his heels. Behind him, his captain, Ryan, was already dismounting, already reaching for the field kit, already speaking in the clipped shorthand of men who had pulled bodies out of ditches together for a decade. "Sire, she's Border Clan. Look at the braid. Sire, the wound's fresh, but it's twisted. Somebody wanted her dead twice. Sire, we should leave her. This looks staged." Cain did not answer any of that. He was looking at the way her fingers, broken-nailed and dirt-creased, had closed around a fold of his riding cloak, as if she had decided, in whatever was left of her awareness, that he was a thing to hold. He said, without turning his head, "We take her." Ryan made the small, tight sound of a man who knew better than to argue in public. "Sire, if she's a plant—" "She's a witness," Cain said. "A corpse tells us nothing. A living witness on the other side of this border is worth more than a clean grave." He bent and slid his arms under her, and she weighed less than his own saddle, and the hum in his chest, the one he was absolutely not acknowledging, got louder. He set his jaw. He carried her up the bank. He laid her across his saddle the way you laid an injured hawk, the way you laid something that might still have talons, and he swung up behind her and anchored her against his chest with one arm, and her head mulled back against the hollow of his throat, and the scent of her, even through blood and creek water and fear, went through him like a struck bell. He had never smelled anything like it. It did not smell like a woman. It did not smell like a soldier. It smelled like a forest he had never been allowed to walk in. It smelled like a law he had spent his whole reign enforcing. His stomach dropped. Ryan, riding up alongside, caught the look on his face and read it wrong, the way aides always did. "She'll live, sire. The healer's good." Kane did not correct him. He looked down at the girl bleeding against his chest, at the dark braid with its border clan weave, at the mouth parted just enough to let breath through, and he thought, with the cold, clear voice he used for counsel, "My kingdom has outlawed her kind, and my body has just recognized her as mine." He tightened his arm around her. He kicked the horse into a canter. He did not tell Ryan what he had smelled. He did not tell anyone, for a long time. She woke to warmth and lied about it. That was her first decision, made before she had fully remembered her own name, before she had remembered Mac or the cache or the creek. Do lay still. She kept her breathing soft and uneven, the way a sleeper breathed, not the way a scout breathed. She took inventory through her skin. Linen. Heavy, good linen, the kind her clan did not own. A bandage pulled tight across her ribs, expertly knotted, the pressure steady. A poultice under the bandage with a scent she half recognized, yarrow and something sharper. A fire somewhere to her left, close enough to warm her cheek, far enough not to scorch. A chair. Someone breathing in the chair. A man. She knew it was a man before she knew how she knew. The breath was too deep for a woman of the clan, too even for a healer who would be fussing with herbs. It was the breath of somebody who had sat up with wounded things before and knew how to be quiet around them. She risked opening her eyes the smallest slit. Stone walls, a hearth with iron dogs shaped like stags, a narrow window with real glass in it, leaded in diamonds, catching a gray northern light she did not recognize. And in the chair across from him, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, the man from the creek. He was watching the fire, not her. That was the part that unsettled her most. A man who had bothered to save her ought to have been watching her to see what he had saved. This one was giving her privacy in her own sleep. She studied him while he wasn't looking. He was older than she had expected a monster king to be, and younger than she had expected a ruler to be, which she supposed canceled out to simply a man. Dark hair cropped close at the sides, a scar along the side of his jaw, pale against weather-darkened skin. The kind of scar a blade left when it had been aimed at a throat and let bone instead. Hands that looked like they had done their own work. No rings, no crown. A plain dark tunic. If you passed him on a road, you would not know he was a king. You would only know to get out of his way. The hum in her chest, the strange new thing that had opened up while she was dying, rolled over like a dog recognizing its person, and she nearly gasped aloud. She caught the sound behind her teeth. "What?" she thought, furiously at the hum. "What are you?" The hum did not answer in words. It answered in warmth. It said, "Him." It said, "Mine," it said, finally. She closed her eyes again very fast. She needed to think. She needed to understand what had happened to her body while she was asleep, because something had happened. Something more than a knife and a creak. There was a weight behind her sternum now that had not been there before. A second pulse, slower than her own, set just behind her heart. A second pair of ears, listening. She had heard the elders describe it only once, in a hushed lesson she was not supposed to overhear, when Lavina had turned 11 without shifting, and the grandmothers had debated whether the child was cursed or merely late. They had said, "The beast wakes or it does not." They had said, "If it wakes late, it wakes hungry." They had said, "And sometimes it wakes because it has finally found a reason." A reason. She thought of Mac's hand on the knife. She thought of the smile he had given her as he twisted it. She thought, yes, I have a reason. And the second pulse behind her heart gave a slow, satisfied thud. The man in the chair spoke without turning his head. You've been awake for 4 minutes, he said. You breathe differently when you're pretending. Her eyes flew open. She could not help it. He finally looked at her, and the firelight was across half of his face, and his eyes were the color of wet slate, and he did not look surprised that she had woken or glad that she was alive. You looked like a man balancing a ledger. You're in Ironhold, he said. The keep, not the town. He's been unconscious for a day and a night. The blade missed the artery by the width of a thread. The healer says you'll mend if you don't do anything stupid in the next week. My name is Cain. I am the king of the Iron Reach. I am the man whose soldiers your alpha was selling, and I am the man whose ridge your alpha tried to leave your body on. I have questions. He paused. And you, he said more quietly, have a choice. She swallowed. Her throat was sand. The hum behind her sternum was purring, actually purring, traitorous thing. She made her voice as steady as she could. What's the choice? She said. He leaned back in the chair. His hands relaxed on the arms of it. He looked, for 1 second, almost tired. You can tell me what you saw in that cache, he said, and I will give you shelter within these walls until the matter is resolved. Or you can tell me nothing, and I will put you back on the border with a fresh horse and a day's rations, and what happens to you after that is not my concern. I do not torture. I do not coerce. I also do not feed mouths that do not feed me. He watched her. Those are the terms. She thought about it. She thought about December, who would be told by now that Naira had died in enemy colors. She thought about Lavina, 11 and unshifted, growing up in a clan ruled by a man who sold trails. She thought about the foot soldiers who had walked into that ravine because their alpha had promised them safety and pocketed the coin of their betrayers. She thought about the second pulse behind her sternum, purring at a man her grandmother had called a monster. She opened her mouth. She said, I accept shelter, but I counter. His eyebrow moved, barely. Go on. I will give you testimony, she said, and my name on parchment, and every trail I know that Mac sold. In exchange, you do not march on my clan. You take Mac. You take the council that knew. You leave the foot soldiers and the grandmothers and the children alone. The ones he sold deserve justice, not annihilation. She met his eyes. Those are my terms. The king of the Iron Reach looked at her for a long moment. The fire popped. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. Finally, he said, very quietly, agreed. And the hum behind her sternum did something that felt, absurdly, like a bow. They did not trust each other. That was the bargain, and they kept to it, which was, perversely, the only reason the thing between them grew. Naira stayed in the healer's wing for 8 days, and in those 8 days, Cain came to the door every morning at the same hour and every evening at the same hour, and he did not sit in the chair again. He stood. He asked precise questions. He wrote her answers himself, on parchment, in a hand so neat it looked printed. He did not ask about her clan's customs. He did not ask about her family. He did not ask why a scout her size had been sent forward alone. He asked about trails, dates, coin weights, signet impressions, the color of the wax, the number of satchels, the phrasing of the tally. He was building a case. She watched him build it. She began, grudgingly, to respect the architecture. On the 4th day, the healer, a stout woman named Sydney with flower-colored hair and forearms like a baker's, told her she could walk in the inner garden if she took it slow. Naira took it slow. She took it so slow that she had time to notice the garden was walled on 4 sides, that the gate at the south end was guarded, that the guard did not look at her with the open hate she had braced for, but with a kind of curious neutrality, as if she were a horse of a breed he had heard of but never seen. She took it so slow that she noticed the child. He was about 7. He had a mop of black hair and a stick he was using as a sword, and he was sitting on a low stone bench pretending to be wounded, clutching his side theatrically and calling out, "I am slain! I am slain!" to no one in particular. He saw her. He stopped being slain. He looked at her with enormous gray eyes that were, she realized with a jolt, Cain's eyes in miniature, and he said, "You're the girl from the creek." She stopped walking. "Am I?" she said. "Father said we are not to bother you," the child said gravely. "He says you are a guest, and guests must not be pestered." "I am not pestering. I am only asking." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "What's your name?" she said. "Maxton," the child said. "I am 7. I am going to be king one day, but not soon because father says he is not done yet. What's your name?" "Naira." He considered that. It is a good name, he decided. It sounds like a bell. She sat down on the bench next to him because her ribs were beginning to argue with the walk, and Maxton, with the instant trust of small children who have not yet been taught suspicion, leaned against her side as if they had known each other for years. The hum in her chest, which had been quiet all morning, woke up and thrummed with something that was not the mate thing from before. Something softer, almost maternal. She looked down at the dark head tucked against her arm and thought, oh no. She was not supposed to get attached. She was a witness. She was a bargain. She was going to give her testimony, and then she was going to go somewhere far from here and become somebody new. Because she could not go back to the clan, and she could not stay in a kingdom that had outlawed what she was becoming. She was certainly not supposed to sit in a walled garden with the air of the Iron Reach warming her ribs like a hearthstone. Maxton, oblivious, began telling her about his pony, whose name was Biscuit, and about Biscuit's feelings, which were apparently complex. Cain found them like that. She felt him before she saw him. The hum behind her sternum gave its now familiar traitorous lurch, and she looked up, and he was standing at the garden gate with one gloved hand on the latch, and an expression on his face she could not read. He was not angry. He was not pleased. He was something quieter than either, something that looked almost like a man watching a door open in a wall he had forgotten was a wall. "Maxton," the king said, "you were told." "I was not pestering," Maxton said, sitting up very straight. "I was being pestered upon." She came and sat. "That is different." Cain's mouth did a thing that was not quite a smile. "Is it?" "It is," Maxton said firmly. "Ask her." Cain looked at her. She spread her hands. "He is correct," she said. "I pestered first. I sat down without asking. I believe the correct penalty is that I listened to the rest of the pony's feelings." Cain's mouth did the not quite smile thing again, and the hum behind her sternum all but sang. He came into the garden. He sat, after a visible internal argument, on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful arm's length of stone between them. Maxton, thrilled, began the pony story over from the beginning for his father's benefit. Naira watched Cain listen. She watched the hard line of his jaw go soft for his son. She watched him ask Biscuit appropriate questions in the exact tone he had used that morning to ask her about lax seals. She thought, this man does not know how to do anything halfway. She thought, this man has been alone. She thought, dangerously, I could like him. And because she was a scout and a survivor and not a fool, she also thought, and that is a problem, because when he finds out what I am, he will have to choose between his crown and his bargain, and I will not be the thing he chooses. Maxton finished the pony story. He announced that he was going to find Biscuit and deliver the compliments Naira had paid him. He bolted off across the garden with the specific gravity-defiant run of a small boy, and then it was only the two of them on the bench, with a careful arm's length of stone and a hum that would not be quiet. Cain looked at the space between them, he said without looking at her. His mother died when he was 4. She waited. He did not go on for a while. The Iron Reach, he said at last, is a colder place than it should be for a child. I try. It is not enough. I am telling you this because you have been kind to him in the span of one garden walk, and kindness to my son buys more than testimony ever will. I am telling you this so that you understand that I am in your debt now, in a way that is not on the parchment. She swallowed. The hum was very loud. She said quietly, he is easy to be kind to. Cain finally looked at her. He said, so, it turns out, are you? He stood before she could answer. He inclined his head, the smallest formal bow, the kind a king gave a petitioner he respected. He left the garden. She sat on the bench with her hand pressed flat to her ribs over the bandage, and she thought, oh, this is going to be very bad. And the hum, unhelpfully, agreed. The first time she nearly shifted, she was alone in the bathing room, and she thought, for one blind, panicked second, that she was dying all over again. It came on without warning. She had been lowering herself into the copper tub, watching the steam curl off the surface, when a sound from the corridor, a man's boot, striking stone in a rhythm she half recognized, set off something under her skin. Her fingertips stung. She looked down and watched, with a detachment that felt like watching somebody else's hand, as her nails thickened and darkened and lengthened a full joint's worth in the span of 2 breaths. Her teeth ached. Her spine felt too long for her body. The hum in her chest, which had been a purr for days, snarled. She clamped both hands over her own mouth. She sank into the water up to her chin. She thought, stop, 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 at the thing inside her, and the thing inside her, to her astonishment, listened. The claws receded. The ache in her jaw eased. Her spine settled back into the shape she had carried her whole life. She sat in the cooling water and shook. She had been told her entire life that she was broken because the beast had not come. She had been told, in whispers and in pitying looks, and in Mac's grooming hand on her shoulder, that she was defective, that she was lesser, that she was lucky the clan tolerated her at all. Little Naira, little scout, little empty thing. And all along the beast had been in her, sleeping, waiting for a reason. She thought about what her grandmother had said once, quietly, when nobody else had been in the room. Some of us wake late, little one. Some of us wake because the world finally shows us its teeth. Do not be ashamed to be one of those. The world had shown her its teeth, Mac's teeth specifically, and his knife. She pressed her forehead to her knees and she cried. Once, hard. The kind of crying that was almost a laugh because it was so long overdue. Then she washed. Then she got out of the tub. Then she wrapped herself in the linen the servants had left, and she stood in front of the small mirror, and she told her reflection, very quietly, nobody here can know. Not the healer, not the boy, not the king. Especially not the king. She meant it. She meant it for the next 3 days. She kept her hands in her sleeves. She kept her temper smooth as riverstone. She ate the meat they sent up and told herself it was just meat, not the thing her new second stomach wanted, which was to hunt. She walked in the garden and made Maxton laugh, and did not let her nails lengthen, even when he hugged her too hard against her mending ribs, and something inside her lit up with protective rage at a bruise he had not even given her on purpose. She was careful. She was, she thought, brilliantly careful. Cain noticed on the 4th day. Of course he did. They were in the small council room, which was not the great council room, because the great council room was full of men who would have objected to the presence of a border clan girl at the king's elbow. In the small council room, there was only Cain, his spy master, a woman named Corali who had hair the color of ash and a mouth that did not move when she smiled, and a long table covered in maps. Naira was walking Corali through the 3rd ravine trail, the one Mac had sold twice, when Cain, across the table, said mildly, "Your hand." She froze. She looked down. Her left hand, resting on the map, had gone claw-tipped without her permission. Not fully, just the index and middle fingers, just a half joint's worth, enough that the points were pressing into the parchment above the mark for the trailhead. She curled the hand into a fist and put it in her lap under the table. Corali, who had certainly seen, said nothing and wrote nothing, and kept her face as smooth as a frozen pond. Cain looked at Naira across the maps for a long moment. He said, "Corali, leave us." Corali left. She closed the door behind her with a click so soft it was almost kind. Naira sat very still. Her heart was going so hard, she was sure the hum behind her sternum would vibrate the table. Cain did not move from his seat. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not call a guard. He folded his hands on top of the map, over the trail she had just sold back to him, and he said, "How long have you known?" "I didn't," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I swear, I didn't. The clan told me I was born without. I believed them my whole life. It woke in the creek. When I was dying. I have been trying," she said, and hated how her voice shook on the word trying, not to let it show. He did not answer for a long time. Outside, distantly, a horn sounded the change of the guard. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet, and she could not tell if it was the voice of a king or the voice of a man. "You know what my law says about your kind," he said. "I know. You know what my grandfather did to the last shifter who walked into this keep." "I have heard songs about it, yes. Yes." He looked down at his folded hands. The silence stretched. She could hear, absurdly, a bird outside the window. When he looked up again, his eyes were the wet slate color they always were, but something behind them had shifted, the way a door shifted when a draft finally moved it. "I wrote that law," he said, "at 19, in a room full of men who had just buried my father. My father was killed by a shifter mercenary in the pay of a rival house. I wrote the law because I was 19, and I was grieving, and I thought a law could keep me safe. I have not repealed it because I have not known how to repeal it without looking weak, and a king who looks weak dies, and my son is 7. She said nothing. She could not. The hum in her chest was doing something complicated, something like hope and something like grief at the same time. He said, "I have been a king for 9 years, and I have signed exactly 2 shifter exile orders in that time, and both of them haunted me. And both of them were for men who had done actual harm, and I still hated signing them. I am telling you this," he said, "because you are the first person of your kind I have sat across a table from in 9 years, and I find that I do not want to sign a third. I find, in fact, he said, that I do not want you to leave this keep. Ever. She stared at him. The claws in her lap had retracted entirely without her noticing. He said, carefully, I did not mean to say that last part aloud. She said, just as carefully, I am choosing to pretend you did not. All right, he said. Thank you. The silence that followed was not the silence of before. It was a new silence, and it had weight, and it had warmth, and it had the faint, undeniable hum of a thread being pulled taut between two people across a table of maps. He cleared his throat. He said, We will figure out the law later. He said, For now, keep the hand in your lap. She laughed. She could not help it. It was a small laugh, and a wet one, but it was a laugh. He almost smiled. The door clicked open. Corali came back in with tea she had not been asked to bring, and the matter, for the moment, was closed. The moment that almost undid them came on a night when it had been snowing for 3 days, and the keep had the muffled, underwater quality that snow gave to old stone. And Maxton had insisted, with the iron will of a 7-year-old, that Naira be the one to tuck him in, because his father told the story wrong. Kane, to his credit, had accepted this insult with grace. Naira had read Maxton a story about a fox who outwitted a bear, and Maxton had fallen asleep with his cheek on her wrist, and she had sat there for longer than she needed to, watching his small ribs rise and fall, letting the hum in her chest do the slow, contented thing it did around him. When she finally eased her wrist free and rose, Kane was in the doorway. He had been there, she realized, for some time. He did not say anything. He only stepped back to let her pass, and then, because the corridor was narrow, they ended up walking the length of it side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, their boots silent on the rugs. At the turning by the north stair, he stopped. She stopped. He did not look at her. He looked at a sconce on the wall as if it had said something interesting. He said, The council will sit in 3 days. Corali has the testimony prepared. Your alpha will be summoned under the old treaty. You will not come, but the refusal is the point. After that, I will ride at the head of a column to the border, and I will take him out of his own hall in front of his own people. She nodded. Her throat was tight. That was the deal, she said. That was the deal, he agreed. He still did not look at her. I wanted to tell you, he said, because after the column rides, things will move quickly, and I do not know when there will be another quiet corridor. She said, very softly, Kane. He finally looked at her. Up close, in the sconce light, his face was not the king's face. It was a man's face, tired and young and carrying too much. And the scar along his jaw was silver rather than pale, and his eyes had gone nearly black in the low light. The hum in her chest reared up like a thing on a leash. His hand came up. She thought for a wild second he was going to touch her jaw. He set his knuckles instead against the wall just beside her temple, bracketing her without touching her, as if he were not sure he was allowed. He said, Naira. Just the name. He said it the way her name ought to be said, the way she had never in her life heard it said. Low and reverent, and as if it were something he was giving back to her, rather than taking. She turned her face, the smallest quarter-inch, toward his wrist. Her mouth brushed the inside of his wrist, barely. A whisper of contact, the kind a person could deny. His pulse jumped against her lip. He made a sound, low in his chest, that was not quite a word. He leaned in. She leaned in. Their breath met in the warm half-inch between their mouths. The hum behind her sternum, which had been thrumming, did something absolutely unprecedented. It answered. From his chest. A low, matching resonance, quieter than hers, slower, but unmistakably there, which should have been impossible, because Cain was a human-line warrior, and the bond hum in her grandmother's stories was a shifter gift. She pulled back an inch to look at him, her eyes wide. "Did you?" she started. At the far end of the corridor, a door banged open. Boots. Ryan's voice clipped, urgent. Sire, there's a rider at the south gate. Clan colors. He's taken 3 arrows getting here. He says he'll only speak to the king." Cain did not move for one full beat. His forehead came down just for a second against hers. Not a kiss. Something older than a kiss. An oath laid against her skin. Then he straightened, and his face rearranged itself into the king's face the way a man buckled on armor, and he said without turning, "I'm coming, Ryan." He looked at her one last time. He said, "Hold that thought." She laughed, a little wrecked. "I'll hold it," she said, "my lord." He went. She stood alone in the corridor with her palm pressed flat against the wall where his hand had been, and she thought about the second hum, the one that had come out of his chest. She thought, he should not have that, she thought, unless. And she did not finish the thought, because down the corridor, faintly, she heard the voice of the rider at the south gate, and she recognized it, and her blood went cold, because it was December's brother. The rider's name was Bram. He was 19. He had idolized Mac since he was small. He had taken 3 arrows in the back getting to Ironhold, and when Naira reached the great hall in bare feet and a borrowed robe, with Cain's hand at the small of her back steadying her, Bram was on his knees on the flagstones in a puddle of his own blood, and he was weeping, and he was saying, over and over, "He killed December. He killed her. He said she knew too much. He said she was asking too many questions about Naira." Naira's knees went. Cain caught her. Bram looked up. Through the blood and the tears, he saw her, and his face did a complicated thing, because Naira was supposed to be dead in a creek in enemy colors, and instead, she was alive in a robe in the enemy king's hall. And for one flicker, she saw him reach for the old story, the easy story, the traitor girl story. Then he saw Cain's hand on her back. He saw the way Cain was holding her up. He saw, she thought later, with the clarity dying men sometimes had, that the story Mac had written was a lie from the first word. Bram said, "It wasn't you. It was never you. It was him. All of it was him." And then he coughed, and more blood came up than a man could afford to lose. And Sydney the healer was running across the flagstones with her kit, and Cain was barking orders, and Naira was on her knees beside Bram holding his hand while he died. And he said, the last thing he said, "Find Corali." The word was so quiet, she almost missed it. Corali. She looked up. Across the hall, in the gallery above, a figure in ash gray was turning very smoothly away from the railing and walking, unhurried, toward the far door. Naira's hum, which had been grief silent, snarled awake. She said, "Cain." He followed her eyes. He saw Corali. His face did not change. That was the terrifying part. His face did not change at all. He said quietly to Ryan, "Seal the keep. Nobody leaves, especially not her. Especially not her." Corali had been Cain's spymaster for 7 years, and in those 7 years, she had built the most efficient intelligence network the Iron Reach had ever seen, and she had done it, it turned out, by running 2 ledgers. One ledger served her king. The other ledger served herself, which was, at the level she operated, indistinguishable from serving an old and starving house whose bloodline she shared and whose throne she intended to put her own nephew on once Kane and Maxton were both inconveniently dead. She had been the one writing the handwritten intelligence Kane had not trusted. She had been the one paying Mac for the border trails, and then paying a second agent to pay Mac a second time so that the first payment looked like someone else's crime. She had been the one who, on learning that a living Border Clan scout had been recovered from a creek and was being housed in her king's own keep, had quietly sent word to Mac that a tidy finish was required, which was why Bram's sister December had been killed, which was why Bram had been shot in the back riding for help, which was why, now, in the small hours of a snowbound night, Corali was standing in the great hall under the eyes of a ring of guards, with her hands folded in front of her, as if she had come to a tea. She did not deny any of it. That was what unsettled Naira most. Corali stood in a pool of torchlight with her ash-colored hair still neatly pinned and her mouth still smooth. And when Kane read the charges, in a voice so level it could have been used to measure a table, she inclined her head as if accepting a compliment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, to all of it. I would like the record to be accurate." She turned her head, just slightly, toward Naira, who was standing at Kane's left shoulder in a proper gown now, with her hair braided the Border Clan way, because she had decided somewhere between Bram's death and this moment that she was done hiding any part of herself in this keep. Corali said to Naira, "I want you to understand that none of this was about you. You were not supposed to survive the creek. You surviving the creek was an inconvenience. You becoming the king's confidant was a second inconvenience. You becoming," she said, with the smallest possible lift of an eyebrow, "whatever you are becoming to him, was a third. I have made my peace with inconveniences." Naira said Bram was 19. Corali said Bram was a lever. She said it the way a carpenter would say, that was a nail. Kane, beside Naira, did not move. He said, "Corali, where is your nephew now?" Corali smiled. For the first time, her mouth moved when she smiled. It was a small, tired, almost fond smile. And it was not aimed at Kane. It was aimed past him, at the gallery. "Closer than you think, sire," she said. Naira felt it a half-second before it happened. The hum behind her sternum, which had been grief and rage in equal measure, shrieked. She turned. She was already turning when the crossbow bolt came out of the shadow of the gallery arch, humming the low, ugly hum of quarrels in flight, aimed with professional economy at the center of Kane's chest. There was no time to shout. There was barely time to move. Naira moved. She did not decide to move. The thing inside her moved, and her body followed, and she was between Kane and the bolt before her mind had finished forming the word no. The bolt took her high in the shoulder, well above the old wound, and the impact spun her halfway around and into Kane's chest, and she felt him catch her with both arms. And she felt, distantly, the wet, warm spread of her own blood across the front of the proper gown. And then she felt something else. She felt the thing inside her, the beast that had been learning her for weeks, finally stop asking permission. Heat, gold heat from the inside out, not a shift, something older than a shift. Light spilled out of her, actual light, through her skin, along the line of her collarbones, out of her open hands, and the bolt in her shoulder, which had been barbed, which had been meant to stay in, hissed and slid out of her flesh on its own and fell to the flagstones. And the wound closed as she watched. The light did not stop. It rolled outward. It rolled across the flagstones in a soft gold tide, and where it touched the guards, it did nothing. And where it touched Kane, it did nothing except make him inhale sharply. But where it touched Corali's nephew, up in the gallery, who was already reloading, it went through him like a sieve, and he screamed, because every corrupted thing in him, every bought loyalty and every borrowed spell, and every drop of the suppressing metal Corali had been feeding him for years to keep him biddable, lit up and burned out of him at once, and he folded over the gallery rail and did not rise. The light rolled on. It reached Corali. It did not burn her. That was somehow worse. It washed over her and showed her, in a clean gold bath, exactly as she was, small and tired and very old inside. And Corali looked down at her own hands in the light and said, "Oh," in a voice that did not sound like a spy master at all. And then she sat down on the flagstones, slowly, like a woman whose knees had finally reminded her how long she had been standing. The light guttered. Naira sagged. Cain caught her full weight. The last thing she heard before she went under was his voice, low and ragged and utterly undone, saying her name the way it ought to be said, over and over. "Naira, Naira, stay. Naira, stay with me." She thought dimly, "I am." And then the gold went dark. She woke in the same linen, in the same bed, with the same hearth, and for a disoriented second she thought she had dreamed the whole of the last week. Then she turned her head and saw Cain asleep in the chair by the bed, his head tipped back, his throat exposed, one of his hands wrapped around hers on the coverlet, and she remembered. All of it. She lay very still and looked at him. The fire had burned low. Someone had put a blanket over his shoulders, which meant Sydney had been in, which meant Sydney had also decided not to wake him. There was a smear of dried blood on the side of his neck that was not his. It was hers. He had not let anyone wash it off him yet. She said, quietly, "Cain." He was awake before the second syllable. He sat forward so fast the blanket slid off his shoulders. His free hand came up and hovered over her cheek without landing, the way it had in the corridor, as if he still was not sure he was allowed. She caught his hand and pressed it flat to her cheek herself. She said, "You are allowed." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and he pressed his forehead to their joined hands, and she felt his breath shake against her knuckles, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When he could speak, he said, into her wrist, "You were not supposed to take that bolt." She said, "I was the only one who could." He said, "I know, that is the problem." He lifted his head, his eyes were red. "I have spent 9 years," he said, "making myself the man who stands in front. I have not, in those 9 years, known how to be the man behind. I am going to have to learn. I am going to be bad at it. I am telling you now so you can prepare." She smiled. It felt watery. "I will be patient," she said, "with your learning." "Good," he said. He turned his face into her palm. He kissed the center of it. That was the first kiss. The first kiss was not on the mouth. It was in the palm of her hand, which was exactly the kind of man he was. He lifted his head again. He said, "The council sat at dawn. Corali has given a full accounting. Her nephew is dead. Mac is in chains in his own hall because when the column rode, the border clan opened the gates themselves. Bram's mother opened them. She walked out with the key and she handed it to Ryan and she said, 'Take him. He killed my daughter and he sold my son. Take him.'" Naira closed her eyes. She let 2 tears go. She did not make a sound. Cain waited. When she opened her eyes, he said, "One more thing." "Yes, the law." She held her breath. He said, "I repealed it this morning. I did not ask the council. I did not debate. I repealed it. I will take whatever weakness the court decides that makes me. I find," he said with the ghost of a smile, "that I do not care anymore." She said, "Cain." He said also, he looked for 1 second like a man afraid. Also, I felt something in the corridor before Ryan came, in my chest. He touched his own sternum, a hum, a thread. I do not have the words. I should not have been able to feel that. I am not your kind. He looked at her. What does it mean? She sat up. Her shoulder twinged but did not scream, which meant the gold light had done more than heal the bolt wound. She took his hand in both of hers. She said, "My grandmother told me once that true bonds answer true bonds." She said that the old law was that a bond recognized a bond across any divide, across species, across border, across law. She said that the hum in the chest was the beast's way of knowing its own. She told me that story when I was 8. I thought it was a fable she told cursed children to make us feel less broken. She met his eyes. "I think," she said, "it was not a fable." He said, quietly, "You are saying that I..." She said, "I am saying that whatever you are mine, and whatever I am yours. And the thing in my chest and the thing in your chest have already decided, and they did not ask either of us." He laughed. It was a real laugh, low and rough and surprised out of him. He said, "Arrogant creatures." She said, "Thoroughly." He leaned in. He paused the way he always paused, the scrupulous, courtly pause of a man who had been raised to ask. He said, "May I?" She said yes, and the first kiss on the mouth was nothing like the ones in the stories. It was slow, and it tasted of tea and of salt, and it was not interrupted, because the horn and the bell and the door of the world were, for once, holding their peace. When he pulled back, he said, against her mouth, "Marry me." She said, against his mouth, "Eventually." He said, "Naira." She said, "Cain, my shoulder has been healed for exactly 1 hour. I am not getting betrothed in a bloody gown. Ask me again in the garden." He said, very seriously, "Noted." He kissed her again. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. Somewhere down the corridor, a small boy was shouting something about a pony. The claiming ceremony, when it came, was a quiet one, because Naira had refused a spectacle, and Cain, who had spent 9 years performing spectacles, had agreed with something close to relief. They stood in the inner garden, not the great hall, because the inner garden was where they had first sat on a bench with a 7-year-old between them, and neither of them had quite recovered from that bench. Spring had come to the Iron Reach in its reluctant northern way, which meant the crocuses had finally stopped pretending to be dead, and the wall of the garden was green at the base. Sydney stood at Naira's left, in a dress the color of butter, weeping into a handkerchief she kept claiming was for her nose. Ryan stood at Cain's right, in clean uniform, with an expression that suggested he had made a bet with himself sometime in the past month, and lost it cheerfully. Maxton stood between them, holding the wooden box with the rings in it, very gravely, occasionally peeking in to make sure the rings were still rings. Bram's mother, Elsha, who had taken a full moon to come down from the border but had come, stood on Naira's right in the place a mother would stand, because Naira's own mother had refused to answer the letter, and Elsha, when told this, had simply put on her traveling cloak. The old bond speaker, a woman from a clan 3 valleys east, whose face was a map of lines, spoke the words. She spoke them in the old tongue, which neither Cain nor most of the assembled Iron Reach nobles understood. And then she spoke them again in the common tongue, because Naira had insisted, because she was done with rites nobody understood. She said, "A bond is a thread between 2 souls." She said, "It is older than any law and any border and any suspicion." She said, "It cannot be faked and it cannot be forced." She said, "Naira of the Vale clan, do you take this man of the human line, knowing that your beast has already claimed him?" Naira said, "I do." She said, "Cain of the Iron Reach, do you take this woman of the shifter line, knowing that your heart has already agreed?" Cain said, "I do." The bond speaker said, "Then let the bond be witnessed." The ceremony called for the claiming mark. It was the part Naira had been nervous about, because she had never bitten anyone in her life, and because her teeth had a habit now of being more than they had been, and because she was not entirely sure how much she would know what she was doing when the moment came. She need not have worried. The hum behind her sternum, which had been quietly harmonizing with the hum behind Cain's all morning, took the decision gently out of her hands. She tilted up on her toes. He bent his head. She set her mouth at the place where his neck met his shoulder. She let her teeth lengthen, a little, just enough. She set the mark. It did not hurt him. She knew, through the bond, it did not hurt him, because his breath eased rather than caught. She drew back. The mark was there, small and precise, 2 crescents over the pulse. It would silver over in a week. It would be there for the rest of his life. He looked at her. He said quietly, "My turn." She tilted her head. She expected teeth. He used his mouth. He set a kiss at the matching place on her neck, long and slow and reverent, and then, with the smallest scrape of his own ordinary human teeth, he made his mark, which was not a shifter's mark at all, but a man's. The bond speaker made a small, surprised sound, which was the closest thing to a laugh Naira had ever heard an elder make at a ceremony. She said, "The old law accepts what the bond accepts," she said, "so it is witnessed." Maxton, who had been vibrating with the effort of standing still, stepped forward and presented the wooden box. Naira slid a plain iron ring onto Cain's finger. Cain slid a plain iron ring onto Naira's finger, because she had refused gold. They turned to face the garden. A cheer went up that was mostly Ryan and Sydney and Elsha, and a lot of soldiers who had been quietly told they were allowed to cheer, and Maxton, who cheered loudest because he had been practicing. Afterwards, there was bread, and there was wine, and there was a long table in the great hall with Iron Reach lords at one end and Border Clan grandmothers at the other, and everyone being painfully polite in the middle. And then somebody, Ryan probably, brought out a fiddle, and the painful politeness dissolved, because it turned out that the old dances of the Iron Reach and the old dances of the Vale clan were, suspiciously, the same dances, which made Elsha laugh so hard she cried, and made the lords pretend they had known all along. Naira danced with Cain first. She danced with Maxton second, who stepped on her feet on purpose because he thought it was funny. She danced with Ryan third, who was a terrible dancer and apologized the entire time. She danced with Elsha fourth, and Elsha held her very tight at the end of the dance and said into her ear, "He would have been proud of you," meaning Bram. And Naira said, "He died for me, Elsha." And Elsha said, "No, little one. He died for the truth, and you are simply what the truth looked like." When the fiddler finally slowed, Cain came back to her side, and she took his hand, and they slipped out of the hall before anyone could make a toast, because Naira had decided during the second dance that she had given enough of this day to other people. They went up the north stair together. They did not speak. They did not need to. The hum in her chest and the hum in his chest were doing a thing that was almost a duet. At the door of the chambers that were now theirs, he paused. He said, "One last check. You are sure?" She said, "Cain, I am sure." He opened the door. He carried her over the threshold because he had been raised in the kingdom that did those things, and she had not had the heart to tell him it was unnecessary. What happened after the door closed was not spectacle. It was slow, and it was reverent, and it was anchored in 100 small consents, spoken and answered. He asked at every threshold. She answered at every threshold. She had never in her life been asked. She wept once for that reason. And he stopped immediately, and she laughed through the tears and said, "No, keep going. These are the good tears." And he laughed too, a real laugh, low and astonished. And then he did keep going. And the first full intimacy between them, when it came, was, as her grandmother had once promised about the right kind of night, a homecoming. The hum in her chest and the hum in his chest, at the moment they finally stilled, rang like two bells struck at the same time, and then, unified, settled into a single low note that would hum between them, under everything, for the rest of their lives. 3 years on, spring had come to the Iron Reach again, which was always a hard-fought victory, and Naira was sitting on the same low stone bench in the inner garden, with a 2-year-old daughter asleep against her ribs, and a 7-month pregnancy making its opinions known in the small of her back. The daughter was named Wren, because Maxton had insisted at the christening that all the best names sounded like small birds, and nobody had been able to argue with that. Wren had Kane's gray eyes, and Naira's dark hair, and a tiny hum in her small chest that had been audible since the day she was born, which meant the Iron Reach was going to have its first openly shifter princess in a generation, which meant the council had had to have a great many careful meetings about titles and protocols, which meant Kane had come home from several of those meetings looking tired and slightly amused, and had said, only to Naira, "My daughter is 2, and she has already repealed more laws than I did in a decade." Maxton, now 10, was across the garden teaching Biscuit the pony, who was now a very elderly pony, to take an apple from his palm without biting his fingers, which was not going well, because Biscuit, like all ponies, was a creature of strong opinions. Elsha, who had moved to Ironhold 2 winters ago at Naira's insistence and Kane's second insistence, was in the herb beds, lecturing Sydney the healer about something Sydney had done wrong with the yarrow, which was a lecture Sydney received with a piece that suggested she had stopped listening some time ago and was simply enjoying the company. Ryan, who was now captain of the King's Own Guard and godfather to Wren, was leaning against the garden gate, pretending to be on duty and actually watching, with the softness men like Ryan only admitted to in gardens, the way Maxton handled the pony. And Kane was coming down the path toward the bench with 2 cups in his hands, one of which had a ridiculous amount of honey in it, because Naira had decided during the pregnancy that tea was only tolerable if it was basically dessert. And he was smiling the smile he only smiled at home, which was the smile Naira had made it her life's quiet work to earn. He sat down on the bench beside her. He held out the honey tea. She took it with the hand that was not currently cradling Wren's skull. He looked at her over the rim of his own cup. He said, "You remember," he said, "the first time we sat on this bench?" She said, "I remember a small boy with a stick pretending to be slain." "I was not pretending," Maxton called across the garden without turning around. "I was mortally wounded." 10-year-olds, it turned out, had the ears of bats. Kane, unperturbed, said to Naira, "I remember sitting at the far end of this bench and leaving exactly an arm's length of stone between us, because I was afraid of what would happen if I did not." Naira said, "And now look at you." "Now look at me," he agreed. He set his cup down on the bench. He reached over and laid his palm very gently on the rise of her belly, over the second child, who had been kicking all morning, and chose that moment, with an apparently inherited flair for drama, to kick hard against his hand. Kane laughed. He said, "This one is going to be trouble." She said, "This one is going to be named after my grandmother, and my grandmother was trouble, so yes." He said, "What was her name again?" She said, "December." He said, "December." He tried it in his mouth. He nodded. "December it is." Then he looked up at her, and his eyes had gone serious in the way they did when he was about to say something he had been carrying around. and she waited, because she had learned in 3 years of marriage that Cain did not like to be rushed into the things that mattered. He said, "I wanted to tell you. I signed the last of it this morning. The border amendment, the shift-a-line inheritance clause. The one the council has been fighting me on for 18 months. It is done. It is law. Ren will inherit clean. So will this one. So will any other." He paused. "So will any other shifter child in the Iron Reach for that matter. I would not have done it if it had only been for ours." She said, "Cain." He said, "I know. I wanted you to know before the bell." The bell was going to ring at midday to announce the signing. She had perhaps 4 minutes. She set her cup down. She set Ren very gently into the curve of his arm, because Ren was a heavy sleeper and a champion napper, and could, in fact, sleep through a bell and a coronation. She took Cain's face in both her hands. She kissed him, slowly, on the mouth, in the inner garden, in daylight, in front of Maxton and Ryan and Elsha and Sydney and the elderly pony, and nobody pretended not to see. Because after 3 years, they had all given up pretending. When she pulled back, his eyes were wet. He said quietly, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For not dying in that creek." She said, "Cain, I did die in that creek. The girl who lay down in that water is not the woman who got back up. That girl thought she was broken. That girl thought her own alpha loved her. That girl thought your kingdom was full of monsters. That girl had to die, my love, for this one to sit on this bench." He said, against her forehead, then, "Thank you for being born again." In the distance, the bell began to ring. Ren, against his chest, did not wake. Maxton, across the garden, cheered. The pony, offended, ate the apple whole. The hum in her chest and the hum in his chest rose together to meet the bell, and settled, and stayed. So, that was the story. The girl the alpha tried to bury in a creek. The king who was supposed to be a monster. The beast that woke because it finally had a reason. And the law that fell because a man finally had a reason to fall it. If you have come this far with me, I would love to know how this one sat with you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how did it land? Drop your number in the comments. Tell me which scene hit hardest. The creek? The garden bench? The bolt in the great hall? Or the honey tea at the end? And if you want more stories like this one, long form, slow burn, with heroines who wake up fighting and kings who learn to stand behind them, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you. I will see you in the next story.